Please welcome Google's Sustainability Lead Data Center Innovation, Priya Chhiba.
Ahoy, Prague. Welcome, and thank you all for being here today. Wasn't it wonderful to see all our keynote speakers focus in on sustainability? Some of the key themes that I heard today was sustainability and collaboration. So JP mentioned that in his keynote presentation a few minutes ago, and DJ highlighted that a few minutes ago as well. So today we have a really exciting panel where we will be discussing how we as an industry can collaborate cross-organizationally on sustainability. So with me today, I have from Cirrus One and representing the CNDCP, Matt Pullen. Give him a round of applause. And then from KO Data, I have Gerard Thibault. And then from the RISE Institute, I have John Summers. Hey, it's really nice to have you all here. Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. So why don't we start off by letting you introduce yourself. So Matt, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Matthew Pullen. I don't normally steal people's chairs.
That's okay.
My day job's to run the European business of Cirrus One, where we currently have approximately a dozen hyperscale colo data centers across the key European markets. But most importantly, I'm here representing the board of the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact.
Thanks, Matt. Gerard, how about you?
Hi, thanks very much, Priya. Gerard Thibault, Chief Technical Officer of KO Data. I've been in the data center specific arena for the last 25 years, starting off back in the Global Crossing days of establishing the Pan-European network. And really my role at KO Data now is to drive innovation and focus on sustainability. And I'm part of the OCP Committee on Sustainability for the Data Center Facility Project.
And John?
Yes, so it's John Summers. I am actually scientific lead at Research Institutes of Sweden, and before going there I was 25 years as an academic in the UK. And I guess I was born on the flashing cursor line. I've been programming a lot all my life in the research. And then obviously the computer became a problem, with the thermal management. That's where I got into actually data centers, trying to manage the energy and the thermal aspects.
That's awesome. Well, aren't we lucky to have all of these panelists here with us today? So, DJ talked about something. He introduced the topic of global surface temperatures. And the IPCC recently published a really alarming statistic. So between 2011 and 2020, it appears that our global surface temperatures are 1.1 degrees Celsius higher than it was between 1850 and 1900. So that is really eye-opening and sobering to some extent, because what it highlights is we have limited time to combat or mitigate climate change. And John, this question's for you. So, what is RISE doing in the cutting-edge research area to help mitigate climate change? And how can we as data center operators support you in some of this research that you're working on at RISE?
Thanks for the question. I think it was great that DJ mentioned it's a Swedish affair, Svante Arrhenius. Being in Sweden myself, I had followed his work. Our first and foremost thing that we've been looking at when we started some of our research initiatives five or 6 years ago was looking at energy efficiency. So this is where, obviously we consume electricity into the electronics, and if we can consume less and do just the same job, then we're walking in the right direction. But I think it's become a little bit more than that, from the operational side. We're trying to understand operational temperatures, etc. What temperature should we be operating at? And I think, there is one or two talks this week about, how hot should we be running our data centers, from an energy efficiency perspective. But I think, now our research in terms of collaboration is really trying to say, well, you bring all this energy into a data center, which has a good exergy, and then the exergy is destroyed, and then we do nothing with that. So I'm talking about the possibility of heat reuse. So we've looked at a lot of, with collaboration, this is really what you need collaboration. Data centers can't do this by themselves. So the synergies with other industries that would use, am I cutting out a bit?
You are cutting out, yeah.
So that's the important thing, is that. But I think now we're starting to look at the initiatives around the scopes of emission. And I think one of the things, data centers are not really the problem. It's everything else that's the problem. I mean, transport and heat are big consumers of energy, primary energy. And can the data center be part of that? And yes, they can, mentioning heat.
Yeah.
But also, can we avoid transport? Yeah, there's been proofs of that in the pandemic. Can we reduce so this could be avoided emissions. And some people are calling this scope 4 emissions. So if we can avoid emissions by using digitalization, and that's part of the research. But this is a collaborative effort.
It's really great to see RISE focusing in on so many of the things that I wanted to talk about today. So I want to dive in firstly to some of the regulations that's been put out by the European Union through the European Green Deal. And I believe there's some changes coming through the Pact in 2023. So Matt, can you educate us on what's coming down the line, and how can we prepare for those changes that's coming through?
Sure, I'll do my very best in just a few minutes. As you say, it all starts with the European Green Deal, the vision that Europe as a bloc will be climate neutral by 2050. And within that vision, Brussels would like data centres to be carbon neutral by 2030. So Brussels is effectively relying on existing legislation, upgrading legislation, and introducing new legislation to realise the vision. Good example of existing legislation, EU taxonomy, which is there to effectively categorise sustainable investments by the biggest companies and financial institutions in Europe. And as part of that, data centres are effectively directed to align to the EU Code of Conduct as it relates to energy efficiency, and also embrace a number of European standards that represent best practice on energy efficiency. A good example of an upgrade to legislation, and really picking on what could happen this year, the European Council and Parliament have determined that as it relates to the Energy Efficiency Directive that's been around for at least 15 years, they want to make some additions. And they're talking about a stretch target of 11.7% on the energy reduction target, which overall is 36% by 2030, before the stretch target relative to energy usage in 2007. When it comes to the data centres, they would like to see data centres with a capacity of 500 kilowatts or more reporting on their energy efficiency and sustainability metrics by May of next year. They would like to make it mandatory for data centres of a megawatt or more to reuse their waste heat, with the caveat where it's possible and where it's economic. And I think also by the end of the year, we're probably going to see proposals come forward for an energy rating system for data centres. So just touching on the Pact, if you want me to just
go ahead.
Do that. So the Pact was formed just over 2 years ago by the European Data Centre Association and CISPE. We have over 120 signatories, and that represents more than 95% of the industry, cloud companies, colo providers, and national trade associations. The original vision was a self-regulatory initiative, and we've been setting targets to help get the industry to climate neutral by 2030. The reality is there's going to be a lot more legislation. And so we're using the targets to really discuss with the Commission the art of the possible and prepare the industry for the legislation.
Yeah, that's great. So Gerard, all of this must be really confusing for you as a data center operator, right? You're part of OCP, you're a member of the Pact. How can the organizations represented here today support you in your decarbonization and sustainability goals? And maybe you want to share a little bit about what KO Data is focusing on from a sustainability perspective.
Sure. Firstly, collaboration is absolutely key to making this work. We need to share ideas, and the OCP in particular is a great way of doing that. I've learned a lot. Certainly, we're working with Mark Dancy on the OCP Ready checklist. Tying into the Climate Neutral Data Pact, again, is very important. It's given us those 5 pillars to look at, and particularly focusing in terms of KO Data sort of strategy, where really sustainability and efficiency is at the heart of what we do, and me as an engineer. We've sort of focused on energy, so we try to make our data centers as efficient as possible. We're operating at around about 1.2 on a per suite basis. But even when you look at the overall, if you measure it on the green grid sort of scale as the complete facility, even with the drag of the administration, we're under the 1.3 target. And that's with a data center load of about 16% of overall. And that's quite a key in looking at the performance across the whole band. We've done things like buy into REGO 100% renewable energy contracts, which over a 12-month period are great, but obviously one of the things we're striving for as part of our technology plan is to make that 24-hour, hour-by-hour carbon-free. So we're looking at our own private wire, local solar, battery energy storage, although we have contracted and paid a premium to bring in a specific wind farm into our facility. Incidentally, JP talking earlier, it's almost like a replay of some of the things that obviously you're doing. In June 21, we switched to hydro-treated vegetable oil to try and drive down the greenhouse emissions from generators and fossil fuels. So we don't use fossil fuels on the site anymore. But in reality, it's a fairly small chunk because you don't run your generators very much.
That's right.
Hydrogen fuel cells play into that, but again, there's capital and operating cost penalties for those. So they're part of the scene.
Yeah.
But again, collaboration, and Madhu on the Ampere presentation, focusing on driving down the one of the PUE is very important, I think.
That's right, yeah. Especially with some of these newer technologies out there, it's really interesting to share ideas and, lessons learned so that I think we can accelerate the transition, right?
We need to.
Yeah. So, a recurring theme that I've heard between the three of you is energy efficiency. And I wanted to share or reshare a tidbit that JP shared in his presentation. So between 2010 and 2018, workloads hosted by the cloud data center segment increased by 2,600%. But at the same time period, the global energy use of all data centers rose by only 10%. So I think from an energy efficiency perspective, as an industry, we've been doing a great job, right? But Matt, I know the Pact is very focused on continuing that trend of improving because there's still gains that we can make in the energy efficiency realm, right? So can you talk about some of the targets that the Pact has set? I know they're very stringent targets, and it's self-regulated too. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. As I said earlier, I do think there's a lot more legislation coming. But the setting of a self-regulatory vision is great because it just enables the dialogue with the Commission. But if the Pact is focused on 5 pillars, as Gerard mentioned. So we've got clean energy, energy efficiency, water conservation, circular economy, and circular heating systems. Circular energy systems. We've been running working groups across monitoring and reporting, energy efficiency, water, and circular economy. I think the big achievement of the monitoring and reporting group was to actually develop and publish this year a audit framework so that small, medium and large companies can demonstrate alignment with the Code of Conduct, was effectively one of the main directives. Interestingly, that initiative was spurred on by SAP, whose auditors couldn't find any way of auditing them against the Code of Conduct. So the Pact has helped to achieve that, which is great. On energy efficiency, Gerard mentioned the targets that have been set initially, 1.3 in a cold climate and 1.4 in a warmer climate for the PUE. But the Energy Efficiency Working Group is really working on trying to solve for the 1 now. The Water Group developed and the Pact agreed the WE matrix target. So, for example, if you have a data center in a cold climate using potable water, but where there's water stress, the target is 0.4 litres per kilowatt hour, for example. The Circular Economy Group has just got started, and I think, you know, the call to arms piece is always that we can't really run concurrent working groups because the signatories provide resource on a pro bono basis. So you just have to prioritise. So I'm really proud of what the Pact's done, but without doubt we can do a lot more.
Yeah, yeah. And John, you know, on the research side, you touched on energy efficiency at RISE, and can you tell us a little bit about the projects you have going on, and you know how those projects can benefit us as an industry?
Yeah, I mean, one of the projects that I can probably refer to is we did win an award for it. It was the holistic cooling control. So this was trying to get the things synchronized so that everything runs a lot slower. Like, you know, with your compressors, you can variable speed compressors, variable speed drives, you can slow things down. And that, from your cooling perspective, that is a good way of getting some energy efficiency. But the other thing is obviously, there's two parts to this energy efficiency in my book. There's the physical limits of computation, which is on the one side, the one, and then there's the other part of it is how effectively or how well we get the heat from where it's generated to where we can either consume it or reject it. And if you think about it, these microprocessors are running at 50, 60, 70 degrees, you know, and that's very useful heat if we can get it at that temperature. And it goes back to this argument about exergy. But I think we get ourselves really tangled up with efficiency, the metric efficiency, and I think I put out a LinkedIn post just recently which got me into a little bit of trouble, because the energy efficiency of compute is very difficult to define. Because, you know, in engineering terms, efficiency and energy efficiency is what you want divided by what you have to pay for. What you want are the digital services, what you have to pay for is the kilowatt hour. Now, how do you measure the digital services in terms of energy, in terms of kilowatt hours? It's very difficult to do. So we still have, from a research point of view, quite a bit to do there. And I think maybe, you know, we should be looking at it in a different way. And maybe there is no such thing as one metric. And I think we may come back to this a bit later, but, you know, the PUE is not an energy efficiency metric. It's a metric that has been very useful for the industry to progress and become more effective at the way it operates around the one.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really say anything about the efficiency of the compute.
Yeah, I think if you look that way.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, I'll look that way. Should have known
So regarding PUE, I know you have some thoughts on how that metric can be improved. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, when we talked about improving it, it's a difficult one to improve because the great thing about the PUE is it is a very simple metric. And simple metrics are very useful in this industry because it helps. And of course, we've been mandating against PUE. But if we are going to use PUE, I think we really need to use it as it's defined in the ISO or in the EM 5600, whatever standard you can get access to. I mean, it's well defined there. But it's still, I think it's not just one metric again. I think it needs to be, and there are 6 good metrics that are mentioned in the Energy Efficiency Directive that are useful. And of course, we mentioned water as being one of them, but also the energy reuse factor, which is something that would be helpful.
Yeah, that is one of the new metrics out there. And talking about energy reuse and heat reuse, so Gerard, heat reuse and capturing data center heat is one of the hot topics, especially here in Europe, and there's going to be requirements for heat reuse coming out, as Matt mentioned. What are some of the challenges that you see out there in industry in tapping into some of these heat reuse networks and to making your heat available for use?
There's a lot of practical problems. Some of it is around no one solution is going to fit the world. So we've got to look at different solutions for different regions and even localities within those regions. UK specifically doesn't have a good history of providing heating networks, but the heating window that's required is very, very small in reality compared to some of the Nordic countries where they're sort of more ubiquitous. In terms of actually providing the heat back into the system, I mean, I think it's a great idea, without doubt. Just to waste it into the atmosphere is sort of nonsense, really. But we need to look at the operating efficiencies and balance those and look on a case-by-case basis. We tend to use as a basis of design in Northern Europe, because it works well, air-to-air heat exchangers. For most of the time, they run dry, and it's just fans circulating on either side of a plate heat exchanger, which means that the PUEs are sub 1.2. And that's great because we then use less energy. But if you try and recover that energy, firstly, it's only 32 degrees centigrade, so it's very low-grade heat. You've then got to, that increases the pressure drop through the system, so increases your fan power. You then need heat pumps to boost the value of that heating up. So actually, you've got to then make a judgment. Would it be better to heat direct rather than do that?
Boosting it, yes.
Part of the problem is that we can't, as a data center operator, guarantee the amount of energy that we've got to give to the network. So because our customers drive the one, we can't determine whether that's going to be fully utilized or not. So we can't make commitments to resell that power unless we know it's there for definite. So that's a conundrum that's very difficult to solve. And even the regulatory thing about reselling power is very difficult to sort of find all the ins and outs of, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think, John, you had an interesting tidbit about a Finnish company and
it was actually in Sweden, I think,
okay.
Because there's quite a lot of initiatives around heat reuse in Sweden and in Finland as well. But the issue really is that you have a colo provider who is providing, who has a heat pump. Well, in one situation, the heat pump is owned by the heating operator. And in one other situation, the heat pump is owned by the data center. So when you do your PUE calculations as per the ISO, you suddenly find that your PUE is greater than 1.2. So there you are, a colo who's trying to sell space to somebody who wants the space, whose mandatory requirement is to be sub 1.2. And sorry, but I'm reusing the heat. But that's where the energy reuse factor needs to come in. And there was a metric that the Green Grid had that never became an ISO metric, which was called the energy reuse effectiveness, the ERE, and it was a combination of PUE and ERF, and I think there was a reason why it was never put forward as a metric. But the two metrics together really need to be seen together in order to have these kind of conversations, and I think it's an education piece at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah. And within the data center facility sustainability track, we are looking at metrics, and maybe that's something we can look at, is what sort of metrics should we incorporate for heat reuse, and especially when it comes to justifying some of these projects, as you mentioned.
Yeah, because often you've got double capex installation. I know we're short of time, but the operator has to put in heat rejection in case you can't reject to the local district
That's
network.
right.
And vice versa, if they can't get the heat from us, do they invest in other heat generation? So, yeah.
Well, you also have to look at the seasonality too, right?
Yep.
Because the heat may not be required at all times of the year.
Sure.
Well, that's a good point, because the example was that they could only reject the heat between September and May. They still have to deal with the heat in the summer months. And I think, putting more plant in, I think one of the things that we haven't talked about probably today at all is that we've been talking and focusing on energy and carbon, but there is an issue around resources, resource efficiency and the use of materials,
That's right.
critical raw materials.
Yeah, and I think we'll have to hold that for another conversation. We're running out of time, so thank you all. So how can you support us and continue this conversation? We have, as DJ mentioned, started a sustainability track with an OCP, and then we also have a data center facility sustainability sub-working group where we recently launched 3 different work streams. One of them is focused on energy, power, and heat reuse. The other one will be focused on construction emissions reduction, which we didn't really touch on today. And the third one is metrics focus, as DJ mentioned. And so we really would appreciate you joining, contacting us, joining, signing up, and participating because, as we all mentioned, we need to work as an industry. If we are going to combat climate change, we need to do it together, and we need to share resources as we do it. So thank you all. Thanks.